Well, today is, again, when I start the PowerPoint, I'm going to stop it parts of the way through and ask a question. And the question will be pretty much about what do you already know before I go into more detail, about it, about our Native American history, to do it too. So, and I left more time for discussion, I think, at the end, because last time I felt like we were kind of pushing the short time for discussion. So there's a lot to talk about, in this one to do too. So if I come out too teachery, tell me that at the end. But this was I did a lot of research, into this one and try to condense about 200 or 300 years of history down to 30 minutes, in terms of that. So Pastor, if you will start us out with a prayer, please.
Yeah. The Lord be with you.
And also with you.
Let us pray. Loving and gracious God, we thank you for this beautiful day, for the sunshine and the reminder that it is not quite yet spring, however much we may live in hope. We ask that your spirit of wisdom and discernment be with us today as we listen and learn more about our shared history with our Native siblings. We ask that you keep our hearts and our ears open to learn and to be curious as we journey through this together. We love you and we pray all of this in Jesus' name. Amen.
Amen. So I don't think we have to spend much time with introductions because I don't see anybody new. Is that correct?
Right.
Right. Okay. In terms of doing that, so that will save us a little bit more time. Now I have to share a screen.
You should be able to.
Okay. And that will be this PowerPoint, which I said we're going to stop, part of the way through. So again, I guess the question that we'd have, or the observations we'd have about, first of all, is this getting out there so people know about it? And is there a way of tracking if people are, watching it later? I know a couple people told me they watched it later, 11 o'clock on a Sunday. They're already doing something else. So I don't know if anybody else has any thoughts on that before we continue about how this is getting out there.
Yeah, and we're announcing it all the ways that we have in church. And then I haven't looked at the metrics to see how many people have watched last week's. I can do that and then report back if you'd like.
Okay, and then is there anybody in the multi-purpose room just today?
No, it's just Matt and I in the conference room.
Okay. Oh, Matt's there. Okay, good. All right, well, let's get started. Don't have to spend much time reviewing, but does anybody have any thoughts on what we already did last week, which was pretty much just to talk about the general overview of what we're trying to do here, to do that too. And so there was just some, laying some background. So does anybody have any comments about last week before we go on? It's always like when you're a teacher, it's always like your class has that silence. So it's just, did anything sink in from last week, or to do it too? But it's just a normal kind of silence I've learned over the years. Silence is not necessarily a bad thing. Okay.
That document of discovery was totally new to me, and I expect new to many people.
Yeah, and like I said, that was something that set me off. On this journey, you might call it too, because I didn't know anything about it until, I don't know, somehow the ELCA thing in 2016 came up in some of my readings, I think, in Living Lutheran or something like that. And I got, what in the world is this? And then I wanted to learn more about it. So, well, if you look on what we're on today, it's March 13th. So it's going to be a lot on what's going on between the Europeans and the settlers and the Native Americans. And it's all based on that whole idea of the doctrine of discovery, which was driving this to do too. And looking ahead, see Pastor Johnson. Have you had any contact with Pastor Johnson, Pastor Aaron?
No, I know that he's planning to be here with Greg next week, I believe.
Okay. Yeah. I got to follow up with them because they're basically the program, next week to do that too. So, and I might be down in Chicago with a grandchild birthday on Sunday, so we'll see. But we'll talk about that later. So anyway, that's what we're on. So get ready for a trip through, back in time. Be a time traveler, I guess, in terms of doing that. And if you look on the left side, this is really what we're talking about today, is what is this parallel histories of Native Americans and European settlements. It doesn't make any difference if you're talking about the French and the Native Americans, or the Portuguese and the Native Americans, or the Spanish. There's this parallel history. And then knowing that this doctrine of discovery, which is really, we're going to keep hitting on and hitting on and hitting on, is being kind of a hidden thing that everybody had in their mind as Europeans. So it's, hey, we have this right, we have this thing, we have to go in and go into this new land and conquer it. And unfortunately for the Native Americans, they were kind of in the way. So again, this is a little bit of background on that too, because one of the things I found out again is that this is right in our own country, in terms of that. It was in 1823, and I highlighted again, it's the absolute right to do that. That was the Native America, or the Europeans' right to come in to do that. They're called to do it, and American Indians only had the right, well, you can live here if we let you. But I call this, what else came over on the boat, to do that too. So we have all these different explorers that are going out, and the more I researched this, there were names that came up that I didn't even know about. It's a long list of explorers, and I tried to just have a few. Question I would ask before we get into that: if you were looking at this boat, and you're a normal United States citizen, what boat would come to mind?
Mayflower.
Maybe the Mayflower.
Okay. Yeah, probably that's the most famous one. We have that really embedded in our whole mythology, I'll call it, of the trip coming over and the pilgrims coming over. And in fact, that's going to be the next slide. We're going to talk about that a little bit too. But there were lots of boats, as you'll see.
The Nina, the Venta, the Anna Maria, what are they? There were three.
Yeah, the three Columbus ships, in terms of doing that to do too. So those are all things, if you think back to your childhood and to your schooling, what are the things you learned about? Exactly what you probably just simply said, the Mayflower and the three Columbus ships, Nina, the Pinta, and the Santa Maria, I think they were to do too. Maybe you learned a little bit about Magellan, him flying around the world, not flying, but sailing around the world. But in this slide, we just had Thanksgiving in November, and we have our whole Thanksgiving traditions here, with the people wearing the hats and turkey and the whole Thanksgiving feast idea, in terms of that, and how this was the start of good relationships between the Native Americans and that. But so we know the story a little bit about the Pilgrims. They were looking for religious freedom. They were persecuted, for their Puritan beliefs. And so they came over here looking for religious freedom, but they had that embedded in them, that idea that this was a land that's uninhabited, uncivilized is the word they talked about. It was here for the taking and was waiting to be colonized by Christians. And they were certainly part of that Christian thing to do too. And so I think that was the second part we don't talk about too much, is that they just came in and stepped on Plymouth Rock supposedly, and then said this land is our land, so we'll take whatever we can for this. And so just a question about, with the Pilgrims to do it too in religious freedom. Can anybody else, I didn't want to go into detail for this, talk about other groups that came looking for religious freedom? Well, if I bring up Maryland, it was named after a queen, and that was, Queen Mary, which, anybody remember what religion she was?
Catholic.
Yeah. Okay. Yeah. So there was Catholics looking for this freedom, so they wanted Maryland, and in terms of that, and there was, as the next graphic will show, there's a lot of them came over here with that idea of looking for religious freedom, supposedly is what they're looking for, but there was also a lot of opportunity for land. I call this the race is on. I just put this little graphic together. Within a few decades, we've got all this going on to do too. And of course, part of the history is shown this here too. We have, of course, we know about it. Again, we're talking about the Puritans in England, and they went to kind of what we call New England. They even called it New England. They didn't name it. They didn't listen to the Native Americans say, what do you call this place? Oh, we're going to call it New England because they do it too. And we know about the Dutch went to New Amsterdam, which is a TV show, also too, to do too. So they were going into kind of the middle states, and then the French, I had a hard time putting that one together. They were coming up into Canada, but then they went down the Mississippi, and then they went up the Fox River, and we know about Green Bay and that kind of history too. So we have Wisconsin's kind of a mixture of a lot of things. And then, of course, there was the Spanish, and they were the ones that started this whole thing, to do it too, because they were the ones that hired Columbus to come over. And so they laid claims to lots of places. They were coming around to the Pacific and California. They were in Mexico, what is now Mexico. They were in South America. They were in Florida, in terms of doing that. So Spain was really the big gun, in terms of doing this. And then, of course, there was the Portuguese, who ended up in Brazil. So that my brother-in-law and sister-in-law are going to Portugal, to do too. So they're having to learn Portuguese. And that's why if you go to Brazil, they speak Portuguese, but then they said, well, that's a different Portuguese. So, and then in the background, you can see where the Native Americans were. There's all these little colors that show different, kind of tribal areas, in terms of that. So it was an amazing, race. And it's almost like you feel like the oceans were full of all these different competing ships that were coming over. And if we know our history, there were literally battles that were going on, and people with the Spanish doubloons and the galleons and the pirates and all those kinds of things. So it was an interesting thing when this is in 1500. You'll see this is when this whole race kind of started, to do it. So, and then I made up this list. These are just some of the explorers. And then let's go back in your history lesson. Ponce de Leon, do you know what he was famous for looking for?
Fountain of Youth.
Yeah, the Fountain of Youth. Yeah. See, that's all the kind of things in our history that we have. We have, this guy was exploring, the Fountain of Youth, and he was running around Florida and, that part of the country. But he also was, laying a claim for Spain. And some of these guys I never even heard of, like the Portuguese explorer. But I didn't realize that Cabot had Italian background, and it was hired by the English. And then, of course, there's Henry Hudson, and you go on and on and on with all these different people that were there. So you can see that my little lines here were all, it was a good time to be an explorer, because you could get hired out, by a lot of them. The Spanish didn't have enough of their own, so they were hiring people out. Any comments about any of those, or any stories or anything about any of these people? Okay, we'll move along. And this is part that we're going to talk about for a little bit, then I'm going to pause and turn this down, and we're going to have a discussion about this. I was looking at and reading about that this was kind of a endeavor that was set up to fail, because of what I deem the Great Divide. And that's kind of my graphic in the middle, because there was this huge gap between the European culture and their mindset and so on, and then what Native Americans were, in their whole mind and their whole culture. So I have different areas. I just put different areas. One was settlements. If you think about the Europeans, they were coming from basically a lot of towns and cities kind of things, and they had pretty good buildings, and they had mayors, and they had city councils, and they had kings and queens, and they had a very, very, a lot of, if you think about the history of all these, if you go to Europe, there were a lot of buildings that were in the 1600s that had been there for centuries, already, and cathedrals and all this kind of stuff to do too. Well, the Native Americans had a much different idea of settlement. Oftentimes, their settlements were transitory. They might be in the winter in one place, and then we talk about the Menominee later too. They, right in our own area, they had encampments, which meant that they would, depending on the season, where they would live. So their settlements were not edifices. They were just places to live and to be practical and those kind of things. So when you come to the European settlers come to the US, well, what happens is of course, they want to build stuff, right away, to do things and set up their own settlement things too. So there was a great divide there because I'm sure Native Americans looked at these Europeans and said, they're building like permanent structures, and what are they going to do here in the winter, or what are they going to do here in the summer, because the weather's going to change. So what do? A lot of us, we just kind of move, especially out west. Natives would, depending on the weather, they would up altitude or down altitude, depending on the weather. They'd move to wherever the buffalo were, or and so on. So settlement idea was not a permanent thing to Native Americans, but certainly to Europeans, they like to have their settlements in place. So another thing was religion. Great divide, just a whole different mindset here, which one side didn't really understand the other, because the Europeans had, again, their established religions, which we're still part of that heritage. We have our established religions. We're Lutherans. We go way back to, the 1500s. In terms that in this same kind of a time period where, Luther was trying to tear down some of those things that were in the way in his theologies, and he was, he was part of that history, in terms of that. But we had the great cathedrals, to there too. So I would say that religion in Europeans was very much housed. It was housed in buildings. It was housed in denominations. It was housed in theologies to do that too. On the left, I was trying to find a graphic that best Native American theology was pretty much in tune with nature. They didn't have churches as much. They oftentimes would have symbolic circles or ceremonies and those kinds of things too. But again, they didn't have churches, as such, to do it too. So it was getting very transitory. So here you have two different whole idea of what religion is. And I don't even know if you can say Native Americans had religion, in terms of it. So I'm going to go back to the two pastors, because you're more experts in theology. What is your reaction to this divide? Pastor Aaron or Pastor Grant?
Well, one thing I was thinking about as I was listening to this is I'm not an expert on all the different tribes that were here, but I imagine there was probably diversity among that there might have been some currents, but there were because I think about like the Aztecs of the various folks down further in Central and Southern America had more buildings as part of their way of doing things. But in the North American context, there's definitely two worlds colliding, and I can see that very clearly for what that's worth.
Yeah, and I appreciate the idea, because South America was kind of a different thing. Even Mexico was a different thing because of the buildings they built, the temples, and the kind of worship they did. And there's all these things about human sacrifice and those kind of things too. That oftentimes pops into mind when we think about those Native American religions, you might call it too. So that's a good point to bring up. But yeah, we're focusing more on North America in this study. So what about you, Pastor Aaron? What did you learn in seminary about?
Mostly what I learned in seminary was how Native spirituality and Christianity really can go hand in hand. I was lucky enough to have a classmate, Kelly Sherman Conroy, who's Lakota and grew up on, I believe it was Pine Ridge Reservation, and her mother's a pastor, right? So like just talking with her, I learned a lot, right? She had people come to her home for service trips when she was growing up, rather than going somewhere for service trips, right? But one thing that Kelly talks about that I really appreciate is just how embodied Native spirituality seems to be, whereas I think there's a tendency in Western Christianity in particular to kind of like be all up in our head and forget like that like the rest of our body needs to be involved as well. And so that's, yeah, I think that's, for me, that's where I see the difference, besides the different rituals and buildings versus maybe not, and is the whole body versus, like, especially Lutherans, we get stuck in our head, I think.
Okay. Yeah, and so you're talking about the present day, and this is more talking about what Europeans ran into when they came over to do it too. So hopefully we've learned from that. So I'm going to kind of move on a little bit, because we'll have a chance to talk more about that in a minute. Of course, the land was a really big thing that was different, a big divide, because ownership is very important to Europeans. You know, they had mortgages and they had deeds and they had fences that they put around their property, and you know, don't cross over this line because, you know, this is my property, that kind of thing to do too. And that's one of the first things they did when they came over. They established claims. You know, of course, they didn't know what they were getting into when they claimed things, because set foot on this shore and I'll claim everything from here to whatever. And they didn't realize that we were talking about thousands of miles to do it too. And this will come up a little bit later, but you know, Native Americans didn't have deeds, and they didn't have mortgages, and they didn't have property lines and those kind of things. Now, there were certainly tribal areas that this is kind of like, we're going to have our area, and maybe the Apaches will have their area too, and sometimes they would kind of overlap and sometimes collide, you know, in terms of that, but there was no visible, you know, dividing line. You're crossing this fence, you're into my property. So that was something that completely foreign to both groups. You know, the Europeans didn't understand what the Native Americans' thinking was, and Native Americans didn't understand this whole thing, and that's going to come up later as basis to the problem. Another interesting divide was work and leisure, you know, in terms of that. The Native Americans, their work was practical work, pretty much. You know, I'm going to make a canoe out of birch bark, or, you know, cut out log, or I'm going to make a spear, you know, so I can hunt and that kind of stuff, and or I'm going to make, you know, baskets, or, you know, whatever it might be. And that was kind of their work, and they didn't, you know, punch a clock or anything like that to do it. They did what needed to be done. And their idea of wealth was much different than Europeans. The Europeans, if you look on that, success was a word I kept coming back to. Europeans wanted to succeed, you know, in terms of they wanted to succeed in getting land. Excuse me. They wanted to succeed in gaining things. You'll see money was very important to them. They had a money system, you know, in terms of that. Each had their own kind of money systems. Gold was very, very important. You know your history of how they were looking for, you know, the lost cities of gold. They were looking for taking gold from, you know, one of the things they did in South America was find out all this gold, and so they wanted to get that, and that was competition. So this whole idea of of work, you know, Europeans, we have this work ethic. You know, it's even embedded in a lot of our culture, you know, in terms of that, you know, the work ethic kind of a thing. And we're hard, you got to work your nose to the grindstone, you know, kind of thing, so you can succeed. You know, oftentimes your success is based on how much stuff you have, you know, in terms of that. If you think about our culture today, I love George Carlin's, his whole commentary on stuff. I don't know if you've heard that one, but it's one of my favorite things. Okay, he talks about people have to build bigger houses and big sheds, because they have to put their stuff, and how they go on trips and they have to take their stuff. So I don't think Native Americans really looked at themselves based on how much stuff they had. So that was another divide. I'm going to pause here. I'm going to stop the share. And kind of go back to our own discussion now to do too. So does everybody see each other again?
No.
No? What do I have to do here?
There should be the screen share on the bottom of your screen. You should be able to then, like, stop share.
I thought it was in the top, so. Anything yet?
There we go.
Hey,
Okay. Yeah, because the question I would have now, as we've gone through this, what do you already know about this? What is your reaction to all this too? Because again, the goal of this whole program, or you want to call it, is to develop understanding, appreciation, I guess, so we can build on that to reach out to relationships. So, and I know that we have people that were in LAMP. We have people that you learn in seminaries to do it, and Pastor Grant, I know you've had some relations to do too. What do we already know before I go on about how this all got started and gets us to the point where we are now?
One thing I'd like to suggest is that the roles of men and women in Native cultures versus European cultures was different. I think there was a more equal society in Native cultures. As they nomadically moved about, there were roles that everyone had to do. They were hunters and gatherers, and equally important for those roles, where it was more European men who came here on the ships and were into conquering those people. Anyway, that's kind of my understanding.
Yeah, so that's a good point to do, because that's a whole nother divide, the role of men and women, even children, in terms of that. So any other things that you want to build on?
A big thing that was striking to me when you were talking about this is just the a general approach of colonialism and this idea of resource extraction, that in many ways we're here to get as much as we can as rapidly as we can, and whatever that means for other people, that's not really that much our concern, because our home isn't here, our home is far away. I know when I was preparing for my time in Madagascar, that was a big part of what you saw as far as how structure was built to extract resources. And in Namibia, where I was serving there too, there were a lot of conflicts over a lot of people looking to get rich quick, and seeing this new space as an opportunity to do that, and then that shaping how we present and how we come in as people into a new space.
I think that still goes on to today, but it makes me think of, can you think about what resources did Europeans not have that were offered in the Americas, besides gold? Do you think about it? Go ahead.
Land.
Yeah, and because Europe was pretty crowded. In
One
terms
of the things I could see is it was land, the ability for the Europeans to set up here and have a piece of ground that was their own, which they probably couldn't have where they came from. And other than gold, this was a big thing with the Europeans. And I don't believe the Native Americans had the same feeling about land. They thought it belonged to everyone.
Mm-hmm.
Well, and that's what I find interesting is at least English Europeans had an idea of common lands, at least those that lived out in the country. Because it was a big deal in like the 1750s, I think it was, when the king and the lord started, fencing off what had up to that point been like public grazing land. So like they had some semblance of that in their own space. But then when they came to the New World, all bets were off. Right?
Right. Yeah.
We're just going to take and consume and grab. Yeah, I find that fascinating.
I think.
Well, I find it too that Native Americans, we want this land, so let's put them there. Oh no, there's something there we want, so let's move them there. Then they moved them to the Black Hills, and they found Black Hills gold, and they moved them again. And Custer was a dumb man. And the Native Americans did get even with them. We went out to Custer Battlefield, and that's quite an adventure.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that's a really good point.
The something that relates even more so to Wisconsin is furs and pelts. They came here, in search of beaver pelts. I think probably they had depleted their their beaver pelts in Europe by that time, if I'm correct, maybe I'm wrong. But I know that they came here without any concern of depleting that population of the beaver, and they certainly did. A few years back, quite a few years back now, I went up to Moosonee, Ontario, Canada. It's on James Bay, which is the south end of Hudson's Bay, and I got to experience a lot of that mentality there, how they had depleted that beaver population and just didn't seem to want to stop. So I think there's something there that they were definitely after as they came here too and found out what we had.
And you know what the beaver pelts were used for?
Hats.
Yeah, it was a vanity thing. It was kind of a symbol to have. If you had a beaver hat, well, you were really in the know, I guess, for things to do too. High society.
And the native people valued the birds and the animals as part of them. I mean, they had messages, they feel like they get messages and understand the animals are talking to them and are valued in different ways. And if you are from a certain tribe or a certain clan, that's a sign of honor because of what you've watched the behavior of an animal.
Yeah, oftentimes it was kind of funny. I had to think, I was glad my parents didn't name me, but oftentimes they would look at a child that was born and then give some animal name to that child because of the characteristics. So that's why you see a lot of names that have animals' names in it too. So yeah, beavers are certainly one of them to do too. And the other one which I found fascinating was we were contributing to the bad habits is they discovered, that tobacco was a kind of a neat thing to do. It was kind of, again, a status thing to go, and that's how to get tobacco. Well, how do you get tobacco? Well, you got to grow it on land. And as it grew further and further and further in demand, well, you needed more and more land. And that's where because tobacco has a whole different meaning to Native Americans, than it does for it's recreational, for for Europeans, but for Native Americans, it's almost a sacred herb. There's a lot of things to do it too. So that was another clash, in terms of that. And I was really appreciative of Pastor Schreiner when I visited the Stockbridge, Muncie and Lutheran Church of the Wilderness, because he had the kids go up by the altar and look around. You see anything different? No, it's a cross. We see this. What is this? This looks like tobacco. And the kids are saying, "Oh, are people smoking during church?" And this whole kind of thing. And then he said, "Oh no," and he explained what it was. So those are some good insights, into, what was really going on. Resources. Whoever brought that up, that's a really good reason for the Europeans came here, because they were lacking resources, to do things too. And of course, they invented new resources of tobacco and beavers and other animals, in terms of that. So the trapping thing here in Wisconsin was a really, really big deal, in terms of that. Put it right in conflict with the Native Americans are here, who were seeing their kind of livelihood wiped out, or their animal brothers and sisters, I guess. Anything else before we go on?
Oh,
Go ahead, Pete.
Well,
Okay.
I wanted to just say that when Anita was talking about that kinship, that I really wonder if whether it's religion, whether it's resources, is really that great divide of our place in nature and our relationship with nature is something that our European tradition really kind of estranged us from the planet. And I read a wonderful book titled Guns, Germs, and Steel, and it's about the last 13,000 years of history. But the kind of underlying point was kind of a spirit or a attitude of superiority that we had in the doctrine of discovery, that these were not really truly developed people, whether it was African American slaves or indigenous people anywhere, that there was a sort of a assumption of subhumanness because they didn't have the big cities and buildings and cathedrals and so on. But it's a wonderful book if people are interested in, you know, the last 13,000 years of history.
And that's one of the things we're going to do in one of our last sessions is develop a list of resources. So if people have anything like that, just email it to me and I'll add it to the list of where, because a lot of the things that I found on here too are from some books that actually are in our library, you know, in terms of it. They were a pretty good collection of books about Native American history. Okay, well, I'm going to move along.
Pastor Grant has something yet.
Oh, go ahead, Pastor.
Oh, I was just going to mention too
I was gonna, well, the fact
Yeah, go for it.
that tobacco is related to land because it farmed out quite quickly because they intensively,
Mhm.
and in turn they kept moving farther inland.
Right. Pastor Grant, you had
Well,
something.
the other thing I was going to throw out was our economic system too, as far as that there was a definite commoditization of both the physical world and also even the people that were here. And so there was an objectifying that kind of went into that. And if you can accrue a lot quickly, that's bully for you rather than thinking about what you're doing to the relationship, what you're doing to this space, this place that is someone's home. So.
Right. Okay, back to sharing the screen. I'm going to spend some time on what happened to Native Americans at this common pattern of, doesn't make a difference whether you're Cherokee or Seminole or Choctaw or many others, they all had this, and there's the Cherokee words for what they called it, the path where we cried, and we translate that as Trail of Tears, you know, in terms of that. And that flower there, I'll talk about later. I'm a lifelong learner, and I didn't know this is actually the state flower of Oklahoma, you know, in terms of it, but it has a legend to it too. So we're going to look at just, okay, come on. Why does it want to move? Okay, we're going to, what I call the exclusion zones. We in our history did a number of steps to exclude Native Americans. And you can take that term wherever you want and exclude them from religion, exclude them from society, exclude them from settlements, exclude them from land, you know, whatever. So there was a number of steps for that. And here's where it started. The British were here, and they, of course, had to set up the 13 colonies and that kind of stuff to do too. And they set up this line, this proclamation of 1763. They said, okay, we're going to make this line, which is basically the Appalachian Mountains. And no one is supposed to go beyond that line because that's Native American territory, you know, in terms of it. And they had won the French and Indian War at that point to do it too. And so they made this lineup. Of course, we know that our history is that the British were kicked out when the Revolutionary War. And then, of course, our country, then people said, wow, that line was set up by the British. And some people had already crossed that line or starting to settle there. So they didn't, they said it was a British thing, ignore that line. This land is our land. We can go wherever we want. It's kind of that whole idea of religious freedom, which we know about. Okay, it's also in our Constitution, which I didn't know about, that there is a clause in there that says Congress can regulate commerce with foreign nations and among several states, but also with Indian tribes, you know, in terms of doing that. So that they were kind of put in the same category as foreign nations, you know, in terms of that. And Congress had oversight and control and could regulate the tribes. So that's right in our Constitution. If you don't believe it, you can look up in the corner, which is, I didn't realize that they were even mentioned in the Constitution. So here's step number 2 for setting up this whole idea of exclusion, giving the power to the government. Okay, and then of course, the famous Louisiana Purchase that came up. You know, Thomas Jefferson got this deal with the French who needed money, and they had no idea what was there, and so they sold this. But all of a sudden, there's this huge piece of land that's wide open, to do it too. So, and then you can look at other areas here too. There was Texas, which was independent from Mexico, but then we got that land. And then of course there's the land out by California and New Mexico and Nevada that was succeeded to us. And then we had got some land from the Russians, to do it too. So all of a sudden, our third step was there's a tremendous amount of land out there for people to go to, where we weren't just confined to the eastern part of the United States, just east of the Mississippi. Now you could go almost anywhere to do it too. So that was number 3. Not looking or even thinking about, there's already people living there. In terms that there were quite a few Native Americans already in this land. Okay, number 4, I call him the hero villain. Andrew Jackson was a really fascinating guy. He was kind of, I don't want to use the word carefully to do it too, but he was a populist president. The presidents before that, like Madison and Jefferson and all those kind of people, were more the aristocrats. And Jackson was, old hickory. He was of the people, kind of a president. He was in Tennessee. He was a good politician. He was a war hero from the War of 1812. He was an army general. He was really noted for his Indian fighting, to do it too. He was a slave owner. So he had all these characteristics of a person that, if you're going to get in conflict with Native Americans who are kind of in your way, this is the guy to lead that. He invaded Florida, in terms of it, because that belonged to the Spanish. So Andrew Jackson, he's my number 4 for how this exclusion all starts, in terms of that. So there was this proclamation they put up. It said, okay, Andrew Jackson's put this whole challenge out there. He said, one of our problems is we got all these Native Americans that are, living in places. And again, we all kind of know about the Cherokee Trail of Tears, but I didn't realize that they were moving the Fox, and they were moving the Choctaws and the Seminoles. And the Seminoles is an interesting story if you want to get into it, because most of them got moved out, but some of them fled into the Everglades, and they're still kind of there today, in terms of that. But they set up this whole proclamation. We have to move all these Native Americans out of here. So this is another exclusion that's really happening, to do it. And, well, where are we going to move them to? Well, we're going to give them this great Indian territory, which is kind of like Oklahoma right now, which is not necessarily compatible to what they were living. They were living in the South, in kind of a moist environment, and we're going to move them to this more northern, very dry, place to do it. But we're going to help them along the way. Jackson was very, very good at saying, well, we're going to move you, and we're going to help you there, and we're going to take you to a good land, those kind of things. He made a lot of empty promises. So that's number 5 on my list. Okay, then of course he's out of office, so Martin Van Buren comes in, but he looks at Jackson's ultimatum, and I kind of count this on. He says, circumstances render it impossible that you can flourish in the midst of a civilized society. You have but one remedy within your reach, and that is to remove to the west and join your countrymen who are already established there. He said that, in the 1830s. But I put a note on there that 6,000 of the Cherokee had already moved in 1817 to Arkansas, but there was already Osage there, and the Osage said, wait a minute, we're already living here. And so there were wars that the Cherokee had with the Osage, and a lot of people killed and maimed, in those wars. So Jackson's idea that there already were Cherokee there that were kind of living a happy life was a false assumption or false news. Okay, then, so Cherokee, you kind of know this, and the Cherokee, if you really get into that, they were a very, very civilized society. They had homes, they had government, they had of their own. They even started to dress like the Europeans. If you look at the pictures of the Cherokee chiefs, they looked just like the Europeans, and wearing the suits and the ties and all that kind of stuff to do it too. But no, we're going to have to get these Cherokee out of here. So this is kind of a sad thing. So you can see that 7,000 troops surrounded their villages and homes and just took them out, and started in groups and put them in encampments kind of like concentration camps. And of course, then the whites took this advantage of, oh, there's all these homes with, with lamps and furniture and good stuff in there. And so they just looted the homes. So there were 17,000 of them forced to march west toward Oklahoma. And 4,000 died along the way. This is that Trail of Tears. And they buried 4 or 15 at every stop. And this is where that legend, I didn't know this. The legend was that every time a Cherokee mother buried a child, a rose would go in its place. And that's the Cherokee rose. That's why it's called the Cherokee rose. And it's ironic that that's the state flower of Oklahoma. Something I learned. Okay, and then this next thing is manifest destiny, which I call the daughter of the doctrine of discovery, to do it too. And this is a wonderful, kind of propaganda poster that was at this time talking to people to encourage them to move to the West. And you'll see there's manifest destiny as a woman of, beautiful woman that's leading this charge, with people on horseback and on boats and on wagons and all this kind of stuff too. So I call it the manifest destiny became, that was, I think, I don't remember which president was, Tyler that even had that term, is that's our destiny. We've got to populate in this area. It's a wonderful place to go. So, like Western history, real short, is basically there was the Indian Wars. We used the military. The military in the Civil War had learned a lot. And one of the things they learned about is to have modern weapons. They had repeating rifles, they had Gatling guns, they had all this kind of stuff. Native Americans, of course, had been armed, but they were armed with inferior weapons and those kind of stuff. So basically they were told, we have these wonderful reservations, which you showed last week, were set up. You got to go to the reservation. Well, Native Americans were looking at that and saying, well, wait a minute, this is not the way we live. We need to follow the buffalo. We need to go around and be free to move. So some of them resisted. And when they resisted, I think it was Anita or someone said too, there was battles. Most of the time the army won. Custer they said he was not a very smart guy and he paid for it to do too. But the army just rounded them up, chased them and killed those. I mean, there's terms like Geronimo and and Chief Joseph and all these kinds of things that are famous for fighting, but ultimately losing, in the battle. So they were either killed or forced to go to the reservation, to do it too, which was not a very good place to live, Okay, and of course, number 8 was the buffalo. The buffalo were a prime resource for Native Americans. They looked at the buffalo as for everything. They used the horns, they used the sinews, they used the meats, they used, everything for that. Well, what did the Europeans do? Oh, it's a great resource. We like buffalo robes. And so they would just go out and kill with their modern weapons, hundreds and hundreds at a time, and just skin them and take the robes and leave the rest to go. And so they eliminated the buffalo. So Native Americans had a major resource that was taken away from them. So this was excluded from that. And then this was a real big one because they said, okay, we're going to give you these great reservations. And there were 150 million acres of those reservations. But the government also put up this little thing. They looked at that and said, we're going to give you, if you're going to be civilized, you have to own land. And so we're going to divide your reservations into parcels. And so each family got, their little homestead, that kind of a thing to do too. It's kind of parallel to the Homestead Act. And so that's kind of good for you because you have your own land, you have your own home, and those kind of things to do too. Well, there was 2 things wrong with that. One is that was, again, foreign to their way of thinking. And then also, they looked at it and said, well, there's not enough people for all these parcels. So we have all this surplus land. So they put it up for sale. And people could go in and buy their land. So it was reduced down to 48 million acres by the 1930s. So I want to end with this. There was some hope. Now, this is where we're ending. 1934, there was an Indian Reorganization Act. They could have their own governments now to do it too. And they were given all this control over a place that was a mess for them because of the years of exploitation and all that kind of stuff. And you might know some of the history in the 60s and 70s of the activists that have really with Native American tribes to try to reorganize and try to rebuild. We can talk about the casinos and those kind of a resource. But as I end with this before we can stop the share, our call is to understand the past and present to feel safe working with our Native American siblings so we can build these relationships to walk together in peace and joy. That's the whole purpose of what we're doing. So have a little bit of discussion, what you liked, what could be better, did you learn anything, what's your own experience, and then look forward to the Stockbridge Monthly Story next week. Okay, now I gotta try to get out of here. Now, does everybody see each other?
Yes.
Okay, so we've got 10 minutes left to do that. Okay, what do you think, about all this? Does that help you get a new basis of understanding and appreciation?
Yeah, one thing I did want to mention that I learned from Colleen Bernew, who's the DEM in Northeastern Minnesota Synod now, is that even with the wins and advancements that Native people have had in the last 50, 60 years, it's still organized, a lot of it, right, with the like white supremacist colonizer background.
Sure.
Like needing to have a blood quorum in order, you have to be so much Native in order to be a member of a tribe, when that's not how many tribes or bands like formulate like being a part of it. Right there's in the news a couple years ago, a tribe that like ceased to exist because there weren't enough people with enough Native blood to like justify the existence, right? So like even with the steps that have been made, there's still so far to go. Not to be a downer, but yeah.
Well, that's why I use the word hope.
Yeah.
There has been some progress, in terms of that, and the purpose of what I'm trying to do is to, as said, it's still embedded, but it's embedded because of this, over 200 years of stuff that we've done as part of our culture. So it's just embedded in who we are, and we have to understand that.
Pastor Grant?
Well, I was really struck by the "it's good for you" statement. Say the people who are just killing the buffalo and skinning them and running off with the pelts. And that gets back to the white supremacy and the idea that in many ways in our consumerist approach to things, we are not particularly aware of what's good for us. We're aware of what amasses wealth in a particular way of measuring it, but we're not particularly good at assessing what's good for us. But then we feel compelled to tell others what's good for them based on our model, and I think that's something that's a striking part that is still definitely alive today. We can do better, and we do better, but there's a long way to go with that.
Other comments, questions?
Yeah.
I got it.
Okay. One of the things that we were talking about from buffalo or whatever, it was a natural resource, and the people believed they would never run out. Back history, whether it was land or gold or whatever, and they craved to have it. It's our thing that we have. How is it we judge success in life by things? And it was just another resource so that that we could exploit. It was kind of God given to us that we could have this.
It took a real effort to bring back the buffalo. They were down to a few thousand, I think, at one point to do now. So an interesting little sidelight. I took my sister-in-law to the Green Bay airport and came back through 54, and I kept going by this buffalo overlook. And I finally drove down that little road. And I have quite a buffalo ranch there off of 54 on their reservation.
Will you be talking later on about the money that is given from the U.S. government to Native people every month and how that really is a European thing of giving money to the Native tribe, and what it ended up doing is causing much problems by giving that money rather than valuing their culture and what they would have wanted from us as a I'm sorry, or at least recognize we should be sorry for the things we've done. Will you talk about that later on?
Not really. I mean, we can kind of bring that up in terms of a further discussion, that might be something that might be a question you could ask both the Stockbridge Muncie presenters and then also the Menominee presenters about how does that working today, in terms of, because that what you're that's a great point, because it made people so dependent.
They're dependent, and then the alcoholism that just because Native people, just because of their genetic makeup even, are more prone to alcoholism. And then when you have alcohol, it's something to do when you don't have to work, you got this check, and you're deprived of your dignity. You may take care of that by turning to drink.
Mhm.
So there's so many branching out from that subject that I think we could discuss.
Yeah, because when I had what was brought over on the boat, you could talk about, well, we brought over alcohol, but we also brought over a lot of disease, in terms of it too.
Pastor Grant, it looked like you wanted to say something a couple minutes ago.
Yes, I was looking to see if I could find a graphic quick. When I used to serve out in Montana, and of course that was the buffalo roamed very freely out there, and they had a buffalo reserve that was nearby where I was serving, and they had a big graphic on the wall that just took you through decade by decade the buffalo herds, and one dot represented, I think it was 1,000 buffalo, and it started off where the West was just about black, and then you can see when the railroads came out, suddenly you can see the paths, because this is where all the buffalo are getting shipped off, and then suddenly there's just one or two dots on this giant white canvas, which was stunning as far as our really unrepentant effect on the natural world that we encountered, and on people's livelihoods and all the things that went along with that. Just something I thought of when you were talking.
Yeah, and I think that when we get into having the Menominee presentation, there's still a real conflict there, because they're so protective of the waters. And of course, there's these mines. They want to have these mines in Menominee River and those kind of stuff to do too. That is right down what Pastor Grant is saying. So there's a conflict still to today between getting resources and protecting the land.
And bringing that oil pipeline from Canada through down to wherever it was going to end on the Gulf. And the Native people are the ones who put up the biggest fight to not have that happen.
Okay. Kind of looking ahead, because we're down to the last couple of minutes for next week. This should be, I'll talk to Pastor Johnson more about that. Really the story of the Muncie Stockbridge. They have a very similar story to the Trail of Tears story, but I want them to tell that, where they started out and how they are today, that kind of stuff. So that'll be the main part of the program next week. So Pastor Aaron, do you want to have any closing comments and a prayer?
I don't really have any comments, but I'll definitely pray.
Okay, anybody else? Because we still have 2 minutes yet, so we can technically do so. Thank you for being here. The chosen few that are coming here, I think, are appreciated. Hopefully we're putting together something that could be used and expanded on in the future. So,
Well, thank you for all the work you put in on this. This is really helpful.
well, it's part of my, like I said, I'm learning more and more about this. As I said, over and over again, the older I get, the more I realize I don't know. And each of you have brought a little piece of, I think, of the wisdom to this too, that that has been really helpful. So
when we went to Montana to the Custer Battlefield, my girls, they were in middle school, and they were amazed, and they learned so much.
okay, so thank you,
All right, well, the Lord be with you.
and then also with you.
Let us pray. God, we thank you for this time together as we learn and grow in our understanding of the history in which we find ourselves to be a part. We pray that you be with us as we continue to digest and think about all of the things we have learned and talked about today, and keep our hearts and ears open as we continue this path together. We love you, and we pray all of this in Jesus' name. Amen.
Amen. So this ends the meeting, and go in peace and serve the Lord.
Thanks be to God.
Thanks be to God.
See you
Bye-bye.
all.